I never believed that mercy could destroy a life until the night I chose a stranger's breath over my own future. It was the coldest October I had ever known in that wretched boarding house on Craven Lane, where the walls wept with damp and the landlady's cat watched me with eyes like judgment. I had spent 3 years saving every penny from mending work and tutoring the grocer's daughters in penmanship, all for one singular purpose: the teaching examination scheduled for the following morning at the Pemberton Institute. Pass, and I would have a position, a modest income, a life of respectability, instead of this slow starvation disguised as genteel poverty. Fail to appear, and I would have nothing. I had turned 24 that summer, and I understood with bitter clarity that opportunities for women like me, without family or fortune or beauty remarkable enough to compensate for either absence, came once if they came at all. I had laid out my only decent dress, a dove-gray wool that I had carefully refashioned from my mother's things after her death 5 years prior. My examination papers were stacked on the narrow writing desk, annotations and practice responses filling the margins. I had even allowed myself the luxury of a candle to study by, though the landlady charged extra for light after 9 o'clock. Everything was prepared. Everything was certain. And then I heard the scream. It came from the direction of the old coaching road that ran behind the boarding house, a sound so raw and desperate that it seemed to tear through the fog itself. I remember standing at my window, my hand pressed against the cold glass, telling myself it was not my concern. The streets were dangerous after dark. Everyone knew that, and a woman alone had no business venturing into the night, especially not on the eve of the most important day of her life. But the scream came again, weaker this time, and I found myself reaching for my shawl before my mind had fully decided. The fog was so thick that night that I could barely see 3 feet ahead, and the gas lamps along Craven Lane created only small islands of sickly yellow light in an ocean of gray. I followed the sound down the narrow alley that led to the old road, my boots squelching in mud, and worse, my heart hammering against my ribs. I should have been terrified. I should have turned back. But there was something in that cry, something that spoke not of a common robbery or drunken violence, but of genuine mortal fear, and I could not ignore it. I found her crumpled beside an overturned carriage, half hidden in the ditch where the road met the scrubland beyond. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, and even in the darkness I could see that she was quality. Her traveling cloak was made of fine wool, and her dress beneath it was silk, now torn and muddy. But it was her injury that made me forget everything else. She was badly wounded, and her face, beautiful even in anguish, was white as bone. She was conscious, barely, and when she saw me, she reached out with a trembling hand. "Please," she whispered, and her voice was cultured, educated, the kind of voice that had never known want or worry until this moment. "Please, help me. He will come back." I knelt beside her in the mud, ruining my only good stockings, and pressed my shawl firmly against the wound in her side. I had no medical training beyond the basic care my mother had taught me, but I knew enough to understand that this girl would die if she stayed here. The carriage was destroyed, one wheel completely shattered, and there was no sign of a driver or horses. Whatever had happened here, whoever had done this, had left her alone in the fog. "I need to get you to a doctor," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. "Can you walk?" She shook her head, and I saw tears mixing with the mud on her cheeks. "My brother," she gasped. "Ashgrove Manor. You must send word to my brother, Lord Marlowe Ashgrove. He will come for me." The name meant nothing to me, but the title meant everything. This was not merely a woman of quality. This was aristocracy, nobility, a creature from a world so far removed from mine that we might as well have been different species. And yet here she was, dying in a ditch, while I, Thea Corsham, nobody and nothing, held the only power that mattered, the power to save or abandon her. I made my choice in the space between one heartbeat and the next. I gathered her in my arms, though she was taller than I and dead weight in her weakness, and I half carried, half dragged her back toward Craven Lane. She lost consciousness twice before we reached the boarding house, and each time I thought she was gone, but each time she gasped back to fragile life. The landlady took one look at us on the doorstep and began to refuse, but I pushed past her with a strength I did not know I possessed and brought the girl into my own small room. I worked through the night, doing everything I could with the meager supplies I had. I cleaned the wound, which looked like it had been made by some kind of blade or sharp implement, though the edges were strangely irregular. I used my best linen, the fabric I had been saving for my examination dress, to bind her side. I made her drink water when she woke, and I held her hand when she cried out in delirium, calling for someone named Verity and begging forgiveness for something I could not understand. The landlady sent a boy to Ashgrove Manor as soon as dawn broke, carrying the message the girl had gasped to me in her brief moments of clarity. I did not go to my examination. I did not even send word to the Pemberton Institute. I simply stayed beside this stranger, this Lady Verity Ashgrove, as I learned her name to be, and I watched the hours of my future burn away like the candle I kept lit by her bedside. When the coach arrived just after sunrise, I was so exhausted I thought at first I was dreaming. It was black and grand, drawn by 4 midnight horses, and it bore a crest on the door that even in my ignorance I recognized as old nobility. The coachman who descended was dressed in livery finer than anything I'd ever seen, and he carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that comes from serving power for so long that one begins to embody it. "Miss Corsham," he said, and his voice was not unkind. "Lord Ashgrove has sent me to convey his sister to the manor, and to bring you as well, if you will consent. His lordship wishes to express his gratitude personally, and Lady Verity has been asking for you." I looked down at myself, at my ruined dress and stained hands, at the wreckage of everything I had worked for, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. There was nothing left to lose now. The examination was over. My chance was gone. I was, in that moment, utterly free, in the way that only the completely ruined can be. "I will come," I said. They carried Lady Verity out on a stretcher, wrapped in blankets from my own bed, and settled her gently into the coach. I climbed in after her, feeling absurdly out of place in my shabby dress amid the velvet cushions and polished wood. The coachman closed the door with a soft click, and then we were moving, rolling away from Craven Lane and everything I had ever known, toward something I could not begin to imagine. Verity woke once during the journey, her eyes finding mine in the dim interior of the coach. "You stayed," she whispered, and there was wonder in her voice, as though the concept of someone caring for her without obligation was entirely foreign. "You stayed with me. I could not leave you," I said simply, and it was the truth, though I did not fully understand it myself. She closed her eyes again, but her hand found mine, and held it with surprising strength. "My brother will want to thank you," she murmured. "But you must be careful, Miss Corsham. Ashgrove is not a place of simple gratitude. There are things in that house, things my father left behind, and Marlowe cannot escape them. I fear you have saved me only to step into something far more dangerous than a wounded woman in a ditch." Before I could ask what she meant, she drifted back into unconsciousness, and I was left alone with my thoughts and the rhythmic sway of the coach. We traveled for nearly 2 hours, leaving the sooty confines of the city behind and entering countryside I had only ever seen in paintings. The fog lifted as we climbed into higher ground, and I saw rolling fields divided by stone walls, forests of oak and ash still clinging to their autumn leaves, and finally, rising against the pale morning sky, Ashgrove Manor itself. It was not the largest estate I had ever seen, but it was certainly the most imposing. Built of dark stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, it sprawled across the hillside like something organic, as though it had grown there rather than been constructed. Towers rose at irregular intervals, and the windows, narrow and deep-set, looked like watchful eyes. There was something about the proportions of the place, something not quite right, as though the architect had been guided by aesthetic principles that had nothing to do with human comfort or conventional beauty. The coach rolled to a stop before the main entrance, and I saw a figure waiting at the top of the stone steps. Even from a distance, even before I saw his face clearly, I knew this was Lord Marlowe Ashgrove. He stood with the kind of rigid stillness that spoke of absolute control barely maintained, his dark coat stark against the gray stone behind him, and as the coachman opened the door and handed me down, Marlowe descended the steps with a swift, predatory grace that made my breath catch. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too angular, too severe, with high cheekbones and a mouth set in a line that suggested neither smiles nor softness came easily to it. His eyes, when they met mine, were a shade of gray so pale they seemed almost colorless, and they held an intensity that was deeply unsettling. He was perhaps 30, perhaps older, the kind of man whose age was impossible to determine because whatever youth he might have possessed had been burned away by things that had nothing to do with years. "Miss Corsham," he said, and his voice was low and precise, each word measured as though speech itself required great effort. "I am told that you saved my sister's life at great personal cost to yourself." I opened my mouth to respond, but he was already moving past me to the coach, where they were carefully lifting Verity out. The transformation that came over his face when he saw her was remarkable and terrible. All that rigid control cracked, just for a moment, and I saw naked fear and something else, something like guilt so profound it was almost grief. He took her hand, and I heard him murmur something to her in a voice too low for me to catch. She stirred, her eyes opening briefly, and she smiled at him with such trust and love that I felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. Then the servants were carrying her into the house, and Marlowe was turning back to me, and the mask of control was back in place as though it had never slipped. "You will stay," he said, and it was not a request. "Until Verity has recovered fully, you will remain at Ashgrove as our guest. I understand that your attendance here has cost you an important examination. I will see to it that you are compensated for your loss and that arrangements are made for you to sit the examination at a later date." I should have been grateful. I should have been relieved. But something about the way he spoke, about the careful lack of emotion in those pale eyes, made me uneasy. This was not simple gratitude. This was something else, something that felt like a debt he resented having to acknowledge. "Thank you, my lord," I said quietly. "But I do not require compensation. I did what anyone would have done." "You did what no one else did," he corrected. And there was an edge to his voice now, something sharp and bitter. "The road where you found Verity is well traveled. Others must have passed. Others must have heard. You were the only one who stopped." He turned then, gesturing for me to follow him up the steps and into Ashgrove Manor. I hesitated only a moment before I gathered my skirts and climbed after him, crossing the threshold into a world that would unmake and remake me in ways I could not possibly have foreseen. The entrance hall was vast and shadowy despite the morning light struggling through the narrow windows, and it smelled of old stone and something else, something faintly chemical that made me think of my father's apothecary shop when I was very young, before his death left us with nothing. Marlowe led me through corridors that seemed to fold in on themselves, past doors that were closed and locked, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors who watched with Marlowe's own pale eyes, until we reached a suite of rooms in the east wing. "This will be yours," he said, opening a door to reveal a bedchamber more luxurious than any space I had ever occupied. "You are not a servant here, Miss Corsham. You are a guest, and you will be treated as such. If you require anything, ring for the housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway. Dinner is at 8. I trust you will join me." Again, not a request. I nodded, suddenly desperately tired, and Marlowe seemed to register my exhaustion for the first time. He paused in the doorway, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened almost imperceptibly. "What you did for Verity," he said quietly, "I can never adequately repay. She is all I have left in this world, Miss Corsham. All that matters. And you brought her back to me." He left before I could respond, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft click that somehow felt final, and I was alone in that beautiful, alien room with nothing but my soiled dress and the growing certainty that I had not merely saved a life the night before. I had stepped into something vast and dark and inescapable, and Marlowe Ashgrove, with his pale, haunted eyes and his careful control, was at the center of it. I walked to the window and looked out over the grounds of Ashgrove, at the formal gardens gone slightly wild, at the line of dark trees beyond, and at the low stone building set apart from the main house that looked like it might once have been a laboratory or workshop. Even from this distance, even in the clear morning light, there was something unsettling about that building, something that made my skin prickle with instinctive unease. Verity's words in the coach came back to me then, her warning about things her father had left behind, about dangers that lurked in this house. I pressed my hand against the window glass and felt its coldness seep into my palm, and I wondered what exactly I had traded my future for, and whether salvation and damnation might not, in the end, be the very same thing. The first night at Ashgrove, I dreamed of machinery that breathed. I woke with a start in the unfamiliar bed, my heart racing, the sound of rhythmic hissing still echoing in my ears, though the room around me was silent. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow, and for a disorienting moment I could not remember where I was or how I had come to be in this grand chamber with its heavy curtains and ancient furniture. Then memory returned, sharp and undeniable. The blood on my hands, the examination I had missed, the pale-eyed lord who had spoken to me as though gratitude were a burden he carried unwillingly. I rose and went to the window, pulling my borrowed dressing gown closer against the chill. The housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, had provided me with clothing, explaining with careful neutrality that Lady Verity had insisted I be given access to gowns that had belonged to the late Lady Ashgrove, Marlowe, and Verity's mother. The dressing gown I wore now was fine silk, far too luxurious for someone like me, and it smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something melancholy that made me think of closed rooms and memories kept under glass. From my window, I could see the grounds spreading out in the moonlight, and there, across the formal garden with its geometrically precise hedges, stood the stone building I had noticed earlier. A laboratory, I was certain now, though I could not have said what made me so sure. As I watched, a light appeared in one of the narrow windows, a flickering glow that suggested candlelight or perhaps a lamp. Someone was there, moving about in the dead of night, and I thought of the mechanical breathing from my dream and wondered if I had truly been asleep at all. The light vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and I was left staring at darkness, my breath fogging the cold glass. I should have returned to bed. I should have dismissed what I had seen as a trick of tired eyes or the watchman making his rounds. But I had learned in the past day that I was not nearly as cautious as I had always believed myself to be, and something about that distant building called to me with an insistence I could not ignore. I dressed quickly in one of the simpler day dresses Mrs. Calloway had provided, a deep blue wool that was still finer than anything I had ever owned, and I slipped out of my room into the silent corridor beyond. Ashgrove at night was a different creature entirely from the house I had seen in daylight. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more absolute, and the portraits on the walls watched with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I moved as quietly as I could toward the main staircase, intending to find a door that would lead me to the gardens and from there to the mysterious laboratory. I had descended only halfway down the stairs when I heard voices drifting up from below, low and urgent. I froze, one hand gripping the banister, and recognized Marlowe's precise tones immediately, though they were rougher now, strained in a way they had not been earlier. "You cannot keep going to that place," a woman's voice said, and I realized with surprise that it was Verity. She should have been resting, recovering from her wound, yet here she was arguing with her brother in the middle of the night. "It is not safe, Marlowe. Father's work should have died with him. His work is the only thing that can save you," Marlowe replied, and there was something desperate beneath his control now, something raw and afraid. "You know what is happening to you, Verity. You know that time is running out. I will not stand by and watch you fade when I have the means to prevent it." There was a long silence, and then Verity spoke again, her voice softer now, sad beyond measure. "And what will it cost you, brother? What will it cost your soul to use Father's methods? He died in that laboratory, remember? He died trying to push past boundaries that should never be crossed, and now you follow the same path." "I have no choice," Marlowe said flatly. Without you, I have nothing. No soul, no purpose, no reason to draw breath. If I must damn myself to keep you alive, then I will do it gladly and call it grace. I heard footsteps then, retreating down the hall, and I pressed myself back against the wall, hidden in the shadows of the staircase. A door opened and closed, and then there was only silence again, thick and heavy. I waited until I was certain I was alone before continuing down, my mind racing with what I had overheard. What was wrong with Verity? What methods had their father developed that both siblings feared and needed in equal measure? And what was in that laboratory that drew Marlowe there in the dead of night? I found a side door that led into the gardens and slipped out into the cold October air. The moon was bright enough that I could navigate the gravel paths without difficulty, and I made my way toward the laboratory with a strange sense of inevitability, as though I had been meant to come here from the moment I first saw it. Up close, the building was even more unsettling. The stone was discolored in places, weathered by time and the elements, and the windows were covered from the inside with heavy fabric that allowed no light to escape. The door was locked, but as I stood there in the moonlight, trying to decide whether to return to the house or attempt to find another entrance, I heard a sound from within that made my blood run cold. It was the same rhythmic hissing I had heard in my dream, mechanical and steady as breathing, and beneath it a low humming that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. This was no dream. This was real, and whatever machinery existed behind that locked door was running right now, in the middle of the night, for purposes I could not begin to imagine. I was still standing there, torn between curiosity and fear, when a hand closed over my shoulder and spun me around with shocking force. I gasped, expecting some groundskeeper or guard, but it was Marlowe himself who stood before me, still dressed for dinner in dark evening clothes, his pale eyes blazing with fury in the moonlight. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, and his voice was low and dangerous in a way it had not been before. "This building is forbidden to guests, forbidden to everyone save myself. You will return to the house immediately." I should have been frightened. I should have apologized and obeyed without question. But instead, I found myself meeting his gaze with a defiance that surprised us both. "I heard machinery," I said quietly. "I heard it from my window, and I wanted to understand what it was. Lady Verity warned me that there were things in this house left behind by your father, things that were dangerous. I think she was speaking of this place." Marlowe's hand dropped from my shoulder, but he did not step back, and we stood so close that I could feel the warmth of him despite the cold night air. His expression had shifted from anger to something more complex, something that looked almost like pain. "My sister speaks too freely for her own good," he said finally. "And you, Miss Corsham, are too curious for yours. This is not some Gothic novel where the brave heroine uncovers dark secrets and emerges triumphant. This is my family's burden, and I will not have you poking about in matters that do not concern you." "But they do concern me," I said, and I was surprised by the conviction in my own voice. "I saved Verity's life. I gave up everything I had worked for to bring her back to you. That gives me some right to know what threatens her, what made her so afraid that she would rather have bled to death in a ditch than return here without warning me first." Marlowe stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift behind his eyes, some internal calculation being made. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge, becoming instead something weary and infinitely sad. "You want to know what threatens my sister? Very well. Come with me, Miss Corsham. Let me show you exactly what kind of family you have entangled yourself with." He turned and produced a key from his pocket, unlocking the laboratory door with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The door swung open onto darkness, and Marlowe lit a lamp that hung just inside the entrance. The light pushed back the shadows, revealing a space that was part workshop, part medical theater, and part something I had no name for. There were tables covered with instruments of brass and steel, some recognizable as surgical tools, others completely foreign to my eyes. There were diagrams pinned to the walls, anatomical sketches rendered with disturbing precision, and beside them mathematical equations that seemed to stretch on forever. And in the center of the room, Dominating everything else stood a large glass chamber connected to an elaborate system of tubes and bellows, all of it producing that terrible rhythmic hissing I had heard in my dream. The chamber was empty now, pristine and waiting. Marlowe walked to it and placed one hand against the glass, his expression distant and haunted. "My father was a brilliant man," he said quietly. "A physician and a natural philosopher who dedicated his life to understanding the mechanisms of life itself. He believed that death was not an inevitability, but a problem to be solved, a challenge that could be overcome with the proper application of knowledge and will. He spent decades developing methods to preserve life, to extend it, even to restore it in cases where all hope seemed lost." He paused, and I saw his jaw tighten. "The experiments were successful in many ways," he continued. "He learned to slow deterioration, to repair damage that should have been irreversible, to sustain life far beyond its natural span. But the cost, Miss Corsham, the cost was terrible. Every year of life he prolonged required some form of exchange, some balance that nature demanded. He drove himself to exhaustion trying to perfect his methods, trying to eliminate the terrible price his successes demanded. And in the end, he died here, in this very room, when the strain of his work finally overcame him. I felt cold despite the heavy dress I wore, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the October night. "And Verity," I whispered, "what does this have to do with your sister?" Marlowe turned to face me, and in the lamplight his features looked carved from stone, beautiful and terrible and utterly controlled. "My sister is dying," he said flatly. "She has been dying for 3 years, ever since our father's death. There is something in her blood, some flaw or consequence that the physicians cannot explain or treat, and it is consuming her from within. The physicians call it a wasting disease, but I know better. I have read my father's notes. I have studied his methods, and I know that the only thing that can save her is contained in this laboratory, in the process he spent his life perfecting." "But the cost," I said, remembering Verity's words. "What is the cost of using his methods?" Marlowe smiled then, and it was the most terrible smile I had ever seen. "That, Miss Corsham, is precisely what I am trying to discover. My father's notes are incomplete, deliberately obscured, as though he knew that someone would come after him seeking to use his work. I have been studying them, trying to reconstruct his process, trying to understand what price must be paid and by whom. And I am very close, I think, to finding the answer." He moved toward me then, closing the distance between us with that same predatory grace I had noticed earlier, and I found I could not step back, could not look away from those pale, burning eyes. "You should leave Ashgrove," he said softly. "You should run from this place and never look back. I brought you here out of obligation, out of gratitude for what you did for Verity. But you would be safer far away from me and the choices I am about to make. This house will consume you if you let it, Miss Corsham. It will take everything you are and remake you into something you do not recognize. And yet you need me," I said, and I barely recognized my own voice, low and steady and strangely calm. "You need someone to watch over Verity while you work in this place. You need someone she trusts, someone who is not bound by family loyalty or aristocratic pride, someone who can tell you the truth even when it hurts." Marlowe's hand came up to my face, his fingers cold against my cheek, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me or turn away, and I could not have said which possibility affected me more. Instead, he simply looked at me with an expression I could not read, something that might have been gratitude or desperation, or the beginning of something that had no name yet. "You are either very brave or very foolish," he murmured. "I have not decided which. Perhaps I am both," I replied. "Perhaps that is what it takes to stand in a place like this and not run into the night." He laughed then, a short, bitter sound that held no humor at all, and he dropped his hand from my face and turned away. "Come," he said. "I will walk you back to the house. And tomorrow, if you still wish to stay after what I have shown you tonight, then I will allow you to sit with Verity. She has been asking for you. She says you have kind hands and a quiet voice, and that such things are precious beyond measure in a house like ours." We walked back through the gardens in silence. The laboratory locked once more behind us, its secrets contained but not forgotten. When we reached the side door, Marlowe paused and looked at me one final time. "Do not trust me blindly, Miss Corsham," he said quietly. "Do not mistake my gratitude for certainty or my need for wisdom. I will do whatever is necessary to save my sister. I will cross lines that should perhaps remain uncrossed. And I cannot promise that my choices will not affect you if you choose to stay." "I understand," I said, though I was not certain I understood anything at all anymore. He nodded once, sharply, and then he was gone, disappearing into the shadowy corridors of Ashgrove like a ghost, leaving me alone with the cold and the silence and the growing certainty that I had just sealed my fate in ways I could not begin to comprehend. I returned to my room and lay down in the borrowed bed, but I did not sleep again that night. I listened instead to the house settling around me, to the distant hiss of machinery that I could no longer pretend to ignore, and to the sound of my own heart beating with a rhythm that was no longer entirely my own. When dawn finally came, pale and reluctant through the narrow windows, I rose and dressed and went to find Verity, because running was no longer an option, and staying might be the bravest or most foolish thing I would ever do. Marlowe Ashgrove had warned me away even as he drew me closer, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was falling into something from which there would be no easy escape. But I also understood, with a certainty that surprised me, that I did not want to escape. Not yet. Not until I knew the truth of what haunted this house and the man who ruled it with such careful, desperate control. Sometimes the dying speak with a clarity the living can never achieve, as though proximity to the end strips away all pretense and leaves only truth. I found Verity in her chambers that morning, propped against pillows in a grand four-poster bed that seemed to dwarf her slender frame. She was awake and lucid, though terribly pale, and when she saw me in the doorway, she smiled with genuine warmth that transformed her face from merely beautiful to something luminous. "Thea," she said, and her voice was stronger than I had expected. "Please, come sit with me. I have been longing to speak with you properly, not merely to gasp my gratitude while bleeding into your only good shawl." I crossed the room and settled into the chair beside her bed, and she reached out to take my hand in both of hers. Her fingers were cold, despite the fire burning in the grate, and I could feel the delicate bones beneath her skin as though there were nothing substantial left of her at all. "I must apologize for bringing you into this house," she said quietly. "I was not thinking clearly when I asked you to send for Marlowe. I should have let you go, should have released you back to your own life before the coach arrived. But I was frightened and in pain, and you were so kind to me, Thea, so impossibly kind. I did not want to lose that kindness. You have nothing to apologize for," I told her gently. "I chose to stay. Your brother offered to send me home, and I refused." Verity studied my face with an intensity that reminded me uncomfortably of Marlowe, and I saw intelligence there, sharp and probing, despite her weakened state. "You have seen the laboratory," she said, "and it was not a question. Marlowe took you there last night. I heard you both returning in the small hours." I nodded, seeing no point in denying it. "He told me about your father's work," I said carefully, "about the methods he developed." Verity closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, they glistened with unshed tears. "My father was a great man who became consumed by his obsession," she whispered. "He loved us, Marlowe and I, but his love for conquering death exceeded even that. When our mother fell ill with consumption, he threw himself into finding a cure, but by the time he succeeded, it was too late for her. She died in his arms while he wept and swore he would never lose anyone else to death's cruelty." She paused, her breath coming shallow and quick, and I squeezed her hand gently. "You do not need to tell me this if it pains you," I said, but she shook her head. "You need to understand," she insisted. "You need to know what my father became and what Marlowe is becoming in his shadow. After Mother's death, Father turned his attention to me. I was only 15 then, still healthy, still whole, but he became obsessed with the idea that I too would sicken and die. He began to experiment, developing a process that could transfer vital essence from one person to another, a way to restore health to the failing by drawing upon the strength of the healthy. I felt my stomach turn cold. Transfer vital essence, I repeated slowly. A medical procedure, highly experimental. Father's notes describe it in scientific terms, as though it were merely a transfusion of life force from one vessel to another. But the reality is far more complex and troubling. The donor gives up years of their own life, their vitality, to restore the recipient. It is not immediate, but gradual. The donor weakens over time while the recipient grows strong. And the process binds them together in ways that transcend the physical. Memories, emotions, fragments of identity become shared between them. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed suddenly too bright, too sharp, and I found myself struggling to reconcile what Verity was telling me with the elegant, civilized room we sat in. "But your father died," I said. "He never used this process on you." Verity's laugh was bitter and brief. "Oh, but he did. He found a willing participant, a young woman from the village who was already gravely ill, and agreed to help save me in exchange for her family being cared for after her passing. Father performed the procedure when I was 17, and for 2 years I was healthy, stronger than I had ever been. But then the effect began to fade, and I began to decline again. And Father, driven to desperation by seeing his work fail, attempted to adjust the process on himself without proper preparation. The strain was too much. He collapsed in the laboratory and died within hours. I sat frozen, my mind struggling to process what she had described. "And Marlowe," I whispered. "He wants to repeat the process. He wants to find another donor." Verity met my eyes, and I saw fear there, real and terrible. "He wants to be the donor himself," she said. "He has been preparing for months, studying Father's notes, perfecting the apparatus. He believes that if he can control the transfer, if he can regulate the exchange carefully, he can sustain me while preserving himself. But I know the truth, Thea. I have read Father's journals, the ones Marlowe thinks are hidden. The process requires complete commitment from the donor. They cannot hold back, cannot preserve themselves. Someone must give everything for the other to truly live. And my brother, in his desperate love, is willing to be that sacrifice." I felt something crack open inside my chest, some resistance I had not known I was holding. The image of Marlowe as cold and controlled shattered, replaced by something infinitely more complex and heartbreaking. "He cannot," I said, and my voice was rough with emotion. "You cannot let him destroy himself for you." "I have tried to stop him," Verity said, and now the tears did fall, tracking silently down her pale cheeks. "I have begged him to let me pass naturally, with dignity, but he will not listen. He says I am all he has, all that matters, but the truth is that he is all I have as well, and I cannot bear to live knowing I consumed him to do so. That is why I left the estate 3 nights ago, Thea. I was running away. I thought if I could disappear, if Marlowe believed me gone, he would finally let go and save himself. But the carriage overturned, and I was injured, and you found me. You saved me, and brought me back to the very fate I was trying to escape. The weight of what she was saying settled over me like a shroud. I had not saved her at all, I realized. I had merely prolonged her struggle and ensured that Marlowe's terrible sacrifice would proceed as planned. The choice I had made in that foggy ditch, the choice I had been so proud of, was revealed as something far more ambiguous. We sat in silence for a long moment, and then Verity spoke again, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "There is something else," she said. "Something I have not told Marlowe because I know it would drive him to act immediately. I have seen her, Thea. The first donor. She appears to me at night, stands at the foot of my bed and watches me with eyes that hold both sadness and understanding. Sometimes she speaks, and when she does, she tells me that what was given cannot be taken back, that the exchange has bound us across the veil between life and death, and that I will never be free until I accept what must be." My skin prickled with instinctive unease. "You believe you are visited by her spirit?" I said quietly. "I know I am," Verity corrected. "Whether she is truly present or merely a manifestation of my conscience, I cannot say. But she is real enough to me, and her presence grows stronger every day. I think she is waiting, Thea, waiting to see what we will choose, Marlowe and I, when the moment comes. Before I could respond, before I could even begin to process this new revelation, the door to Verity's chamber opened, and Marlowe entered. He stopped short when he saw me there, his expression flickering between surprise and something that might have been displeasure. "Miss Corsham," he said with careful formality, "I trust my sister is not overtiring herself with conversation." I rose from my chair, suddenly acutely aware of how close I had been sitting to Verity, of the intimacy of tears and confessions. "She has been telling me about your father's work," I said, meeting his gaze directly, "about the procedure and what it requires." Marlowe's jaw tightened, and he looked at his sister with something like reproach in his pale eyes. "That was not your secret to share," he said quietly. "But it is my burden to carry," Verity replied, her voice steady despite her tears. "And Thea deserves to know what she has become entangled in. She deserves the choice to leave before you do something you cannot undo." "There will be no harm done," Marlowe said carefully. "I have studied every detail, accounted for every variable. The procedure will work, and you will live, and that is what matters." He turned to me then, and I saw the wall he had rebuilt around himself, the careful control reasserted. "I would like to speak with Miss Corsham privately," he said to Verity, "if you will excuse us." It was not a request, and Verity, exhausted by our conversation, simply nodded and closed her eyes. I followed Marlowe out of the room and down the corridor to a small sitting room overlooking the gardens. He closed the door behind us and then stood there in silence, his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You think me obsessed," he said finally. "You think me reckless or desperate for what I intend to do. I think you love your sister so completely that you cannot see past your own need to save her," I replied softly. "But love alone does not make a choice right, Lord Ashgrove. It only makes it understandable." He turned then, and the look on his face was raw and unguarded in a way I had not seen before. "If you were dying," he said, his voice rough, "if you were fading and I had the means to save you, would you not want me to use it? Would you not wish for me to do whatever was necessary?" The question hung between us, impossible and profound, and I found myself unable to answer it. Because the truth was that I did not know what I would do in his position. I had never loved anyone enough to test those boundaries, never been loved enough to inspire such devotion. "I think," I said carefully, "that true love requires the strength to honor the wishes of the person you care for, even when those wishes break your heart. Verity does not want you to sacrifice yourself for her. She would rather pass peacefully than live with that burden." "Then she does not understand the depth of my commitment," Marlowe said, and he moved toward me with that same controlled grace that made my pulse quicken. "She does not understand that without her, I am merely existing, not living. This procedure is not a sacrifice, Miss Corsham. It is the only path forward that I can see." He was standing very close to me now, close enough that I could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the fine lines of exhaustion and grief that marked his face. And I realized with a shock that ran through my entire body that I was not afraid of him. I should have been. Everything about him spoke of a man walking a dangerous path. But instead of fear, I felt something else entirely, something warm and entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. "You barely know me," I said, and my voice came out breathless. "Why does my opinion matter to you? Why tell me any of this?" Marlowe reached up and touched my face, his fingers cold and gentle against my cheek. "Because," he said quietly, "in the span of 3 days you have shown me more honest care, more genuine compassion than I have received from anyone save Verity in my entire life. You saved her without thought for yourself, without any expectation of reward. You stayed when I warned you away. And you stand here now, challenging me not because you judge me, but because you understand what is at stake. That is why your opinion matters, Miss Corsham. Because you make me remember what it feels like to be seen as something other than an obsessed man or a tragic figure." I could not breathe, could not think beyond the sensation of his hand on my face and the weight of his words settling into my bones. This was madness, I knew. This connection between us, forged in crisis and secrets and the shadow of loss, was nothing that could easily endure. But in that moment, standing in that quiet room with sunlight streaming through the windows and Marlowe's pale eyes holding mine, I did not care about practicality or propriety. "I will help you," I heard myself say. "Whatever you need, whatever the procedure requires, I will assist you. But I have one condition." Marlowe's hand dropped from my face, and he stepped back, his expression guarded once more. "Name it. You must give Verity a true choice," I said. "You must explain to her exactly what you plan to do, including what it means for you, and you must accept her decision even if it is not the one you hope for. No secrets, no proceeding without her full understanding. That is my condition for helping you, Lord Ashgrove. Honesty, even when it is difficult." He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing my words, calculating what they meant. Then slowly, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "I will speak with her tonight, lay everything before her honestly, and respect her wishes. Though I suspect you are asking me to give her the power to refuse the only hope we have." "Perhaps," I said quietly, "but perhaps that is a power she deserves to hold." Marlowe smiled then, sad and strange, and somehow beautiful despite everything. "You are a remarkable woman, Thea Corsham," he said, and it was the first time he had used my given name. "I think you may be my undoing or my salvation, and I cannot decide which prospect affects me more." "Then we are even," I replied, "because I feel exactly the same about you." The spirit came to me on the fourth night, and I understood then that some connections transcend death itself. I had fallen asleep in the chair beside Verity's bed, my hand still holding hers, exhausted from hours of watching over her while Marlowe prepared for the conversation he had promised to have with his sister. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and in my dreams I walked through corridors that shifted and changed, always searching for something I could not name. I woke to a presence in the room, a coldness that had nothing to do with the dying fire, and when I opened my eyes, I saw her standing near the window. She was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair that hung loose around a face that held both sorrow and a strange kind of peace. Her dress was simple, a servant's dress from years past, and she seemed to shimmer slightly in the moonlight, as though not entirely solid. But it was her eyes that held me transfixed, eyes that were filled with understanding and melancholy wisdom. "You are kind," she said, and her voice was soft as a whisper, gentle as wind through leaves. "I can see it in you, the same compassion that moved me to help the young lady. But kindness must be tempered with wisdom, especially in this house. Love alone cannot solve what has been set in motion." I wanted to call out, to wake Verity, but something in the spirit's expression stopped me. She meant no harm, I realized. She was simply here to deliver a message, to warn rather than threaten. Beside me, Verity slept on, her breathing shallow and troubled, and I understood that this visitation was meant for me alone. "He will attempt the procedure soon," the spirit continued, her form wavering slightly like a reflection on water. "Lord Ashgrove will try to transfer his life essence to his sister, and he believes he has perfected what his father could not. But I have watched from beyond, and I know the truth. The process cannot be controlled the way he imagines. It requires absolute surrender, complete acceptance, not the desperate clinging to hope that drives him now." "Why are you telling me this?" I managed to whisper, finding my voice at last. "What do you want from me?" The spirit moved closer, though she did not touch me, and I felt the cold intensify around me like a winter wind. "I want what I wanted in life," she said simply. "I want the young lady to be free. I gave my remaining time willingly to save her, and I do not regret that choice. But the gift has become a chain, binding both her and me to this house, to this endless cycle of decline and desperate attempts at salvation. The only way to break it is for her to accept what must be, or for the process to succeed with true willing surrender from all involved." "I do not understand," I said, though part of me feared I understood too well. The spirit's expression grew even sadder. Lord Ashgrove loves his sister, but his attempt will be driven by fear and guilt as much as love. That is not enough. The process his father created requires purity of intention, complete peace with the outcome. He cannot achieve that while clinging to the hope of preserving himself. Someone must choose freely, without reservation, to give everything. Otherwise, the machine will fail again, and both siblings will be lost. Then what can I do? I asked. How can I help them? The spirit began to fade, her form growing more transparent with each passing moment. You must help him see clearly, she said, her voice growing fainter. You must help him understand that some acts of love require letting go rather than holding on. And if he cannot do that, if he insists on proceeding with divided heart, then you must be prepared to make a choice yourself, a choice that will determine all of your fates. She vanished then, dissolving into the shadows, and I was left alone with Verity still sleeping peacefully beside me, and a profound chill that slowly began to dissipate. I sat there trembling, my mind racing, trying to process what I had witnessed. Was it truly a spirit, or had exhaustion and stress created a vivid waking dream? I did not know, but the message felt true regardless of its source. The door opened softly, and Marlowe entered, carrying a lamp that pushed back the remaining shadows. He stopped when he saw me awake, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Thea," he said quietly, crossing to my side. "You look troubled. What has happened?" I opened my mouth to tell him about the spirit, about the warning and the terrible choice she had described, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? Instead, I simply shook my head and stood, my legs unsteady beneath me. "You promised to speak with Verity tonight," I said, and my voice sounded distant even to my own ears, "to give her the choice. Are you prepared to keep that promise?" Marlowe studied my face in the lamplight, and I saw him register the unease there, the weight of something unspoken, but he did not press me for explanations. Instead, he simply nodded and moved to his sister's bedside, placing the lamp on the table and gently shaking her shoulder. "Verity," he said softly, "wake up. We need to talk." Verity stirred and opened her eyes, focusing first on Marlowe and then on me. Her expression was knowing, resigned, as though she had been expecting this moment and had already made her peace with it. "You are going to tell me about the procedure," she said, and it was not a question. "You are going to ask for my consent to sacrifice yourself." Marlowe sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand, and I saw his control waver, saw the careful mask slip to reveal the desperate love beneath. "I am not asking," he said quietly. "I am telling you that I will not lose you, that I cannot lose you, and that there is a way to save you that requires my willing participation. I have studied Father's notes for months, Verity. I have refined the process, improved the apparatus. I can save you, and the cost to me will be bearable if it means you continue to live." But Verity was shaking her head, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "You are deceiving yourself, brother," she whispered. "You are not seeing clearly. I have read the same notes you have, the ones you do not know I found. Father's final entries, written in his last days. The process does not divide life neatly between two people. It requires complete surrender from the donor, and even then it grants the recipient only borrowed time before the decline begins again. You would give everything for a temporary reprieve, Marlowe, and then I would face this again, alone and burdened with the knowledge that you are gone because of me." Marlowe's face went white, and I saw the truth of her words strike him deeply. "That cannot be correct," he said, but his voice was uncertain now, the absolute conviction faltering. Father would have been more explicit about the limitations. Father was beyond reason by the end, Verity said gently, consumed by his desire to perfect what could never be perfected. The process is built on a flawed foundation, and no amount of refinement can change that fundamental truth. I will not let you pour your life into that machine, brother. I will not let you become another restless spirit tied to this house by regret and unfinished purpose. The room fell silent, except for the soft crackling of the dying fire, and I watched Marlowe struggle with what his sister had told him, watched his certainty crumble and his desperate hope transform into something darker. I could see him searching for alternatives, some other path that would allow him to save her. It was Verity who broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "Let me go, Marlowe," she said. "Let me pass with dignity and grace, knowing that you will live and find some measure of peace in this world. That is all I ask of you. Do not make my death meaningless by following me into darkness." Marlowe stood abruptly, his hands clenched at his sides, and I saw the grief and helplessness warring in his expression. "I cannot," he said, his voice rough and broken. "I cannot simply stand by and watch you slip away. I do not have that strength." "Then lean on someone who does," Verity said, and her eyes found mine across the room. "Thea has shown us both what true strength looks like. She gave up her future for a stranger, stayed in a house full of mysteries and sadness, and has somehow managed to see past your walls to the man beneath. Let her help you, brother. Let her teach you how to survive loss, because I promise you, you will survive it. And someday, perhaps, you will even find peace with it." Marlowe turned to look at me then, and the expression on his face was so raw, so utterly vulnerable, that I felt something break open in my chest. He was brilliant and wounded, and completely exposed in that moment. And I understood with absolute clarity that I had fallen in love with him, impossibly and against all wisdom, and that this love would either heal us both or leave us forever changed. I went to him without thinking, crossing the space between us and taking his cold hands in mine. "Listen to her," I said softly. "Listen to what she is offering you. Not death, but release. Not loss, but the chance to live without impossible burdens. There is courage in accepting what cannot be changed, Marlowe. As much courage as in fighting." He looked down at our joined hands, and I saw tears tracking silently down his face, the first I had seen him shed. "I do not know how," he whispered. "I do not know how to let her go when she is everything that matters. You learn," I said gently. "You learn one breath at a time, one moment at a time, until one day you wake and realize that the grief has become something you can carry instead of something that crushes you. And you do not do it alone. I will be here, Marlowe. I will stay for as long as you need me." He pulled me into his arms then, a sudden movement born of desperation, and I held him while he shook with silent sobs. Behind us, Verity watched with sad, grateful eyes, and I knew that she understood what I was offering, what it would cost me to stay in this house and love this complicated, devoted man. But I also knew that I would pay that cost willingly, that whatever future I had abandoned had led me to this moment, to this choice, and that I would not change it. We stood that way for a long time, the three of us connected by grief and love, and the acknowledgement that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is surrender to what must be. Finally, Marlowe pulled back and steadied himself, and when he spoke, his voice was controlled again, though I could hear the effort it required. "Very well," he said to Verity. "I will honor your wishes. I will not perform the procedure, but I will remain at your side every moment until the end. And I will find a way to live with this choice, though it may take longer than I can imagine. You have not failed me," Verity said softly. "You have loved me, and that is everything. Now love yourself enough to let me go peacefully, and love Thea enough to let her help you heal. She is strong enough for this, brother. Trust her as I trust her." Marlowe nodded once, sharply, and then he turned and left the room without another word, and I knew that he was going to the laboratory one final time, not to use the machine, but to dismantle it, to ensure that its promise could tempt no one else. I moved to sit beside Verity again, and she squeezed my hand with what little strength remained. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For saving me that night, for staying, for loving him when he is so difficult to love. You are a gift, Thea Corsham, and I am grateful that my last days have been spent in your company." I held her hand and watched the firelight play across her pale face, and I felt the spirit's presence again, faint but approving, as though even she could sense that the cycle was finally breaking, that the burden was being lifted not through desperate science, but through acceptance and grace. When dawn came, pale and cold through the windows, Verity was still breathing, still holding my hand, and somewhere in the distance I heard the sound of destruction, and I knew that Marlowe was keeping his promise, dismantling the apparatus that had haunted his family for too long. We would all bear the weight of the choices made in that room, I knew, but it would be a weight we chose freely, with clear eyes and honest hearts, and that made all the difference between despair and hope. Verity died on a morning when the first snow fell, soft and silent, covering Ashgrove in a blanket of white that made the world seem clean and new. She had held on for 3 weeks after that night when Marlowe destroyed the laboratory. 3 weeks of quiet days and peaceful nights where we sat with her and read aloud from her favorite books and spoke of memories both beautiful and painful. She did not suffer at the end, or if she did, she bore it with such grace that we never knew. She simply grew lighter, more transparent, as though she were slowly becoming part of the air itself, and on that snowy morning, she opened her eyes one final time, looked at Marlowe and then at me, and smiled with such pure contentment that I knew she was finally free. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was gone, slipping away as gently as a breath released, and the room was suddenly empty in a way it had never been before. Marlowe did not weep. He simply sat holding her hand for a long time, his face still and peaceful in a way I had never seen it, and when he finally stood and turned to me, I saw that something fundamental had shifted in him. The desperate control was gone, replaced by a quieter, deeper kind of strength. "She knew," he said softly. "At the end, she knew that I would survive this. She trusted me to live, and I will not betray that trust." I went to him and took his hand, and together we stood at the window watching the snow fall over the gardens and the ruins of the laboratory, which he had reduced to rubble and ash. The ghost had appeared one final time the night he destroyed the machine, standing in the doorway and watching him work with an expression that might have been gratitude or forgiveness, or simply relief. When the last piece of apparatus was shattered, she had looked at me and nodded once, and then she had faded into nothing, released at last from her long vigil. The funeral was small and private, attended only by the household staff and a few distant cousins who came out of obligation rather than affection. Marlowe delivered no eulogy, made no grand speeches about loss or memory. He simply stood beside her grave in the family plot and said goodbye in a voice too low for anyone but me to hear. And then he turned and walked back to the house with his head high and his shoulders straight, and I knew that Verity would have been proud of him. In the days that followed, Ashgrove began to change. Marlowe ordered the laboratory site cleared and planted with a garden in Verity's memory, white roses and jasmine that would bloom in spring and fill the air with sweetness. He opened rooms that had been closed for years, letting light and air into spaces that had grown stale with secrets. He went through his father's papers methodically, burning what was dangerous and preserving what was valuable for the advancement of medical knowledge without the taint of unethical experiments. And slowly, carefully, he began to rebuild not just the house, but himself. I stayed through all of it, though he gave me many opportunities to leave. He arranged for me to sit the teaching examination at a private institute, even hired tutors to help me prepare. But when the day came, I found I could not go. The woman who had cared so desperately about that examination felt like a stranger to me now, someone from a different life entirely. I had found something at Ashgrove that I had never had before, something I had not even known I was searching for. A place where I was needed, where my presence mattered, where I could be useful and valued, not for what I could provide, but simply for who I was. Marlowe and I did not speak of love for a long time. It seemed inappropriate somehow, disrespectful to Verity's memory, to acknowledge the feelings that had grown between us during those terrible weeks. But it was there nonetheless, in the way his eyes found mine across the dinner table, in the way my hand sought his when we walked through the gardens, in the silences we shared that were more intimate than any words could have been. It was on the anniversary of the night I found Verity in the ditch that he finally broke that silence. We were in the library, a room I had come to love for its warmth and the way the firelight played across the spines of thousands of books, and I was reading while Marlowe worked on correspondence at his desk. He set down his pen suddenly and spoke my name, and something in his voice made me look up immediately. "Thea," he said, and then he paused as though gathering his courage. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting, because if you interrupt, I may lose my nerve entirely." I set my book aside and waited, my heart beginning to race. "1 year ago tonight," he continued, "you made a choice that changed the course of my life and Verity's life in ways you could not possibly have anticipated. You gave up your future for a stranger, and in doing so, you gave me something far more valuable than my sister's life. You gave me hope. You showed me that there was still goodness in this world, still people who acted out of compassion rather than calculation, and you made me believe that I might be worthy of redemption despite everything I had done and planned to do." He stood and crossed to where I sat, kneeling before my chair so that we were eye level, and I saw in his face a vulnerability that took my breath away. "I am not an easy man to love," he said quietly. "I am scarred by loss and guilt and years of isolation. I carry darkness with me, Thea, shadows that will never fully lift. But I love you with an intensity that terrifies me, and I believe, I hope, that you might feel the same. I am not asking you to marry me, not yet, because I know that would be presumptuous given our different stations and the strangeness of how we came together. But I am asking if you might consider staying at Ashgrove, not as a guest or a companion, but as an equal partner in rebuilding this house and this life. I am asking if you might consider giving me the time to prove that I can be the man you deserve, the man Verity believed I could become." I felt tears streaming down my face, warm and healing, and I took his hands in mine and held them tightly. "You do not need to prove anything to me," I said softly. "You have already shown me who you are in 1,000 small ways over these past months. You are a man who loved his sister enough to destroy his life's work for her peace. You are a man who honors his promises even when they break his heart. You are a man capable of extraordinary change and growth. And yes, Marlowe, I love you. I have loved you since that night in the laboratory, when you showed me your darkness and trusted me not to flee from it." He pulled me from the chair and into his arms, and for the first time since Verity's death, I felt him truly relax against me, the last walls crumbling away. We stood that way for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, and I thought of all the choices that had led us to this moment, all the sacrifices and surrenders and small acts of courage that had woven our lives together. I had missed my examination. I had given up the safe, respectable future I had planned, but I had found something infinitely more precious. A love that had been forged in darkness and tested by loss and emerged stronger for it. We were married in the spring, in the garden Marlowe had planted in Verity's memory, with white roses blooming all around us and the scent of jasmine thick in the air. It was a small ceremony, attended by the household staff who had become like family and a few of Marlowe's academic colleagues who had helped him catalog and ethically preserve his father's legitimate medical research. Mrs. Calloway wept happy tears, and the vicar who performed the ceremony remarked that he had never seen a couple look at each other with such obvious devotion. I wore a dress of ivory silk that Marlowe had commissioned from London, simple and elegant, and he wore a black suit with a white rose in his lapel. When he placed the ring on my finger and promised to love and cherish me for all the days of his life, his voice was steady and sure, and I knew that he meant every word. And when I made my own vows, promising to stand beside him in light and in darkness, through joy and sorrow, I felt Verity's presence like a blessing, a gentle approval that made my heart swell with gratitude. The years that followed were not without their difficulties. Marlowe still had nightmares sometimes, dreams of the laboratory and the choices he had almost made. I struggled with the dramatic change in my circumstances, with being Lady Ashgrove instead of plain Thea Corsham, with navigating a social world I had never been trained for. But we faced these challenges together, supporting each other through the hard moments and celebrating the good ones. And slowly, gradually, Ashgrove stopped being a house of secrets and became a home filled with warmth and laughter. Marlowe returned to medicine, but this time with a focus on helping rather than conquering death. He opened a clinic in the nearby village, offering free treatment to those who could not afford physicians, and I often accompanied him, learning basic nursing skills and coming to understand the satisfaction of healing rather than merely preserving. We established a scholarship in Verity's name for young women seeking education, and every year we hosted the recipients at Ashgrove, listening to their dreams and ambitions and doing what we could to help them achieve their goals. On quiet evenings, when the house was still and the fire burned low in the grate, Marlowe would sometimes take my hand and thank me for that night in the ditch, for the choice I had made that seemed so small at the time, but had altered everything. And I would remind him that I had not saved him or Verity, that they had saved themselves by choosing love over fear, surrender over desperate control, life over the terrible machinery of forced immortality. We never saw the ghost again after that night when Marlowe destroyed the laboratory. But sometimes, on winter mornings when the snow fell soft and silent, I thought I felt a presence in the garden, a gentle watching that felt like gratitude and peace. I like to imagine that the first donor had found her rest at last, that she no longer walked the halls of Ashgrove chained by regret and anger. And I hoped that somewhere, in whatever realm she now inhabited, she knew that her sacrifice had not been meaningless, that it had led eventually to healing and redemption, even if the path had been long and painful. 5 years after our marriage, on another snowy morning, much like the one when Verity died, I gave birth to our first child, a daughter with Marlowe's pale eyes and my dark hair. We named her Verity Grace, and as I held her for the first time with Marlowe sitting beside me on the bed, his hand gentle on my shoulder, I thought of all the choices that had led to this moment, the examination I had missed, the stranger I had saved, the love I had found in the darkest of places, the life I had never imagined but had somehow earned through mercy and courage, and the willingness to stay when running would have been so much easier. I had come to Ashgrove with nothing but the clothes on my back and the blood of a dying woman on my hands, and I had found everything: purpose, love, family, home. Not because I was special or chosen, but because I had made one small choice in a foggy ditch on a cold October night, a choice to stop and help when everyone else had passed by, a choice to be kind when kindness was neither expected nor rewarded. Sometimes I knew that is all it takes to change the course of a life. One moment of compassion, one act of mercy, one willingness to step into the darkness and offer light, even when you have so little to give. That is the lesson Ashgrove taught me, the truth I carried forward into all the years that followed. Love is not about grand gestures or heroic sacrifices, though those have their place. Love is about showing up, about staying, about being present in the hard moments and the beautiful ones and all the ordinary days in between. And if I had learned nothing else from my time in that strange, haunted house, I had learned that. I had learned to stay, to fight for what mattered, to surrender what could not be saved, and to trust that even in the darkest nights, dawn would eventually come. Marlowe leaned down and kissed my forehead, then our daughter's, and I saw in his eyes that he understood all of this too, that we had both been transformed by loss and love and the grace of second chances. We would never forget Verity, never stop missing her, but we would honor her memory by living fully and loving completely and teaching our daughter that strength comes not from refusing to break, but from learning how to heal. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, making everything clean and new. And inside, in that warm room with my family around me, I felt a peace I had never known before, a certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The examination I had missed was nothing compared to this. The life I had planned was nothing compared to what I had found. And I would make the same choice again, 1,000 times over, if it meant arriving at this moment, this love, this home. Some debts, I had learned, are paid not with sacrifice, but with presence. Not with grand gestures, but with the steady, faithful act of choosing to stay. And in staying, in being present through all the darkness and light, we find not just redemption for others, but redemption for ourselves. That is the story of how I came to Ashgrove, how I missed my teaching exam to save a lord's injured sister, and how at dawn the manor's coach came for me, bringing me not to destruction, but to the truest life I had ever known.